there. U.S. President Donald Trump has named the senior Treasury Department official David Malpass to be the next leader of the World Bank after former chief Jim Yong Kim resigned unexpectedly last month. What does David Malpass stand for? What changes will be brought in if Mr. Malpass is approved to lead the World Bank in the next few years? And will there be any other nominees challenging him for this top position? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Xu Qingduo, Senior Fellow at the Pango Institution, Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and we shall also talk to Robert Cab, Director of the Economist Corporate Network, who is standing by in Hong Kong via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. Who is this guy? Why did he get nominated, John?
Well, I think he's, well, first answer the second question. He's nominated because of his association with Donald Trump. I think he played a quite important role as an economic advisor to President Donald Trump during his campaign, and I think his credentials are also quite impressive. He has served as a chief economist at a very large investment bank called Bear Stearns for I think 13 years, for a long time anyway. He's also time with the Secretary. Working with Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Mnuchin, as his Undersecretary of International Affairs. So I think his career has passed both the private sector as well as the government. And in my opinion, I think his credentials at least will qualify him.
What do you think of his track record?
Well, his track record, for example, working for Bear Stearns, the investment bank, which collapsed and unleashed the 2008 financial crisis. That's one point people have with his choice, nomination. And secondly, obviously, he's a loyalist and campaign advisor for Donald Trump. There's a concern that he would continue to push for the Trump's agenda. That's America First in World Bank. Which will go against the World Bank's mission, let's say. For example, the World Bank top priorities including poverty reduction and also climate change, fight climate change. But for Donald Trump, climate change is a hoax. So whether Mr. Malpass will continue to fight that, that's a big question mark over there.
Hi, Robert Cab. Now, closer look at the mission and the mandate of the presidency of the World Bank. What do you think are the priorities for the newly appointed leader of the World Bank? What would be the path if this guy were to be appointed new president of the World Bank?
Hi, Yang Rui, and Happy New Year, by the way. I think following the appointment of someone like David Malpass, you're going to see a big effort towards reform. It's worth noting that the outgoing president of the World Bank was himself a reformer, but of a different mold. He didn't have, this is President Kim, of course, he didn't have the background in banking and finance that Malpass does. And I think Malpass, just as the previous comments being made, suggested is going to take a harder line on reform. I don't know if he can change too much with the overall objectives of the bank, but I think he'll try to bring a more bottom-line approach to how it lends money.
Can you brief us very quickly on the World Bank? It's, of course, one of the major arms of, say, the Bretton Woods system in the wake of the Second World War, and the World Bank was created to help rebuild the war-torn continental Europe. Of course, UK was one of the countries that benefited enormously from the World Bank in the wake of the Second World War. But can you tell us more about the mission of the World Bank?
Sure. Well, the World Bank really was founded to address issues like you mentioned there, rebuilding in terms of infrastructure. That's always been one of its focus areas, but particularly on poverty reduction. It's really focused on that. One of your other guests was talking about climate change. That's been later introduced to one of its mandates, but it's overall poverty reduction, and it's really geared towards developing world economies and trying to provide low-interest loans to help in that process of building infrastructure for the ultimate goal of reducing poverty.
Here are a few issues in dispute, and when we look at the candidacy of Mr. David Malpass. John, obviously, like President Donald Trump, Mr. Malpass is not a fan of multilateralism either. He has criticized the institutions like the World Bank and IMF for being intrusive and entrenched. What do you think is likely to be the path of the World Bank if under this guy's leadership?
I think he's going to introduce some major reforms. I think he is particularly, in addition to the issue you mentioned, he is a little bit opinionated regarding the multilateral role of these international financial institutions. I think he's also very critical of the bureaucracies of the bank. He's also very critical of its loaning patterns. In other words, he thinks that the World Bank makes too many loans to countries that don't need, including China. And he is for a very pro-growth agenda here. And of course, I think I totally agree that he has I think he's a little bit into this agenda of, make America great again. The World Bank is very much controlled by the United States. But I think that's a minor issue, though. I think the major things he's going to do with the World Bank is to introduce reforms with respect to its bureaucracy, with respect to its loaning patterns, I think.
Mr. Malpass is known for being a Trump loyalist, as I said earlier in the previous question. And most of the key members that filled in what is called the wartime cabinet under the presidency of Donald Trump are pro-populism. They don't quite agree with multilateralism. They are in favor of populism and unilateralism. Do you think this is an opportunity for the U.S. government or a nightmare for the future of the World Bank?
Well, that's the concern, what kind of policy, what kind of reform Mr. Malpass is going to introduce, given his criticism about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Remember, Mr. Kim had worked very well with China in terms of poverty alleviation, including and also Belt and Road Initiative projects, because he considers those projects are critical to developing countries to enable them to develop their economy and to reduce poverty. But Mr. Malpass obviously is very critical of China's investment and also its loan from the Chinese government, banks to other countries over there. So there is concern whether he can deal with the China relationship constructively, and also given he's from the Trump administration. Remember the relationship between China and the United States. The U.S. is basically launching an economic war against China. For example, cracking down on Huawei using the state power. Whether he will also criticize World Bank, that's obviously one of the concerns.
Let me go back to Robert. President Trump says the World Bank is encouraged to spend money more effectively and wisely. What does he mean?
Well, I think what was even obvious to the outgoing President Kim, the World Bank is a sprawling bureaucracy. There aren't many government agencies within the U.S. government or these multilateral institutions from the UN across to the EU and then with these Bretton Woods organizations as well that haven't developed very large institutionalized systems that I think that's, if you want to look at the positive side of the Trump approach, it's to make things more efficient. Yes, there is hostility to multilateralism. By the way, I should point out that David Malpass has rejected the allegation that he's a populist. He doesn't see his approach as populist, but rationalist. And he does, I think, make a distinction between his view of China and multilateral institutions, say, as opposed to Peter Navarro, who takes a much more hawkish and hostile view.
I totally agree with what Robert said. I think there's a clear distinction between him and Peter Navarro. I think he's been working very closely with Mr. Mnuchin, and Mr. Mnuchin has a very different view from these other people surrounding Donald Trump. And also I want to mention one thing. Last year, the Treasury Department actually increased its budget of capital infusion into the World Bank. I mean, that's a very strong sign that it's not going to acting like in the world of Peter Navarro and the like.
Yeah, probably. I agree. I think, of course, within the U.S. administration, according to a former U.S. official, there are three types of officials. One of the group is like a decoupler, basically decoupling U.S. economy from China. Peter Navarro belongs to that category probably. Mr. Malpass can hardly be said, as a part of that group. And he's going to also, I think, visit like Japan, China, to win the support and to explain his ideas of how he's going to govern. If you give me the support to become the governor of World Bank, so we will have more chance to listen to him.
Robert, we are here to look at the past, the present, and future of the World Bank, one of the few very influential multilateral financial institutions that were built in the wake of the Second World War. Having said this, let's review very quickly the legacy of the predecessor. I mean, the outgoing president of the World Bank. What do you think has been achieved under his leadership, and what are the challenges as a result of his leadership?
Well, one of the things he did which created a lot of controversy was, as I mentioned, the sorts of things that Mr. Malpass will try to accomplish, and that is to streamline the bureaucracy. He fired some senior executives. He eliminated some positions. They also appointed a new chief executive, so that was to make it more efficiently organized, I guess you could say. And yet it seems that a lot of what, at least under the latest term presidency, not as much was done. John Gong was very correct to say that Mr. Malpass, by the way, was instrumental in helping raise the capital funding for the bank to give it a lot more money to now lend out, even if it's going to be doing it in a different way. So that's been the most recent legacy, has been one towards streamlining, but not gone as far as many would like. And Malpass's objectives, it seems, would be to do even more reform and take things further, with more capital, by the way, which he has been a contributor to.
Robert, what are the things that need to be respected by the successor in terms of assets that should be held dear in a positive way?
Well, I think absolutely along the lines of what Mr. Xu was talking about. It's not that China itself should be concerned about any hostility towards China. The world should be. I mean, China is now the planet's second largest economy. It is also, although it's a borrower from the World Bank, it's also an important contributor. So it needs to be a very cooperative approach to dealing with China. And it shouldn't be seen, whatever he's doing, as being anti-China or by that measure anti-anything. It should just be towards trying to reform the bank to be more efficient, not to promote unilateralism. So that's going to be a challenge he has. And, I would just hope that there really will be an attempt by him. He's been giving positive signals so far that he won't take the sort of negative rhetoric we associate with the Trump White House about being anti-globalist entirely. He's just trying to be more, we would say, rationalistic in his approach to multilateral lending.
Thank you so much, Robert. Then why did Mr. Kim, the outgoing president of the World Bank, decide to resign? And that was a surprise for maybe the White House, or may not. I mean, what's implied in the understatement of my follow-up question is whether Mr. Kim has come under huge pressure from the White House to resign.
Well, officially it's all because of money. It's reported that there's a second opportunity out there that pays, I guess, it's a lot more. I mean, he's getting paid about a little bit less than $500,000 a year. I think it's around like $400,000 a year. And it's reported that there's an investment bank in South Korea that's giving him an offer. I guess it's offering a lot more than that. So the official narrative here is that he's leaving for the money. But I agree with you. Maybe there are other reasons. Maybe he's under pressure from Washington, and he is also actively seeking other opportunities. So we don't know yet. But at least what's reported out there is that he's leaving. He's abruptly resigning because of another opportunity out there. I want to also add another comment to what Robert just said. I think I'm very hesitant to rush to characterize Mr. Malpass as anti-China. I think what he said about China to some extent has a lot of sense. I mean, he's talking about the loans made in China not necessarily needed. I think we have to understand how World Bank works. I mean, the World Bank people, they have their own performance metrics. They make loans, they write loans, and at the end of the day, these loans will be evaluated. And China happens to be a very good market for receiving these loans. The loans are performing very well. The loans are being paid on time, and that's why people working in the bank, people making these decisions like the market so much. But I think even from China's perspective, we're not so sure we desperately need money from the China bank, from the World Bank anymore. So I think what he said about making loans to China is not necessarily anti-China. So
counter-arguments, Mr. Xu, I'm afraid, are this presidency of Donald Trump has made it very clear China is our public enemy number one. Well, here's just one small step short of saying that explicitly. China has been listed as a major strategic threat to the U.S. national security in many ways, in many official documents. Therefore, this guy who is nominated by this president, who is surrounded by so many hawks, super hawks, many in China are wondering aloud if this new president, if he is to be the next president of the World Bank, will adhere to a line of neutrality. Will he take the principle of impartiality seriously in shaping the new policy, the new path of the World Bank? You have many reasons to defend this guy. He will keep a distance from the White House, sure. He should not be labeled a populist or anti-China. We shouldn't exaggerate the hostility that's cherished by some of the other guys in the so-called wartime cabinet of President Donald Trump. So what do you think of the difficulty with which this new president will have to comply with the principle of neutrality, or he would rather act differently?
Well, that is very key in terms of the relationship between World Bank and China in the future under his leadership, let's say, if he's elected over there. And I think, of course, there's a chance for him to become more neutral, to distance himself from the Trump administration. I'm working for the multilateral financial institution. I will be independent over there. That would be welcomed, obviously. But his past rhetoric in terms of a Belt and Road, obviously, that's not some nice things he has ever said about Belt and Road. Despite the reality that that is welcomed warmly by many developing countries, yes, there are a few questions in terms of a few projects over there. But the legitimate concern is like he's from such a government, whether he will maintain his independence in terms of dealing with China. That is, I think, that for the Chinese side, there is.
Let me go back quickly to Robert for his views on this issue. Robert, a couple of years back, there were many discussions as to increasing the voting powers of emerging markets. China is, of course, no exception in the proposed reform of this multilateral financial institution. And China faced very strong opposition, if not reluctance, from the House of Representatives in reforming the voting spectrum. Given the fact, since the end of the Second World War, it's the Americans who would always lead the World Bank and the Europeans IMF. And therefore, it's very difficult for China to remain pretty calm and say, we trust this guy.
Well, I can understand that, and I think what Mr. Xu was just talking about is applicable certainly from a Chinese perspective, or like I said, from any perspective. We shouldn't have an antagonistic leadership at any multilateral institution, I would advocate. And we're going to have to take a wait-and-see attitude, assuming that Mr. Malpass gets the nomination. I mean, not just the nomination, he actually gets the role. He'll have to prove himself. There's only so far he can do, even if he is antagonistic to, say, the Belt Road Initiative. He can't ignore legitimate projects. So if there are credit risk officers and others involved, so it's not something that he can arbitrarily just say what the bank can and can't do. So I understand China's concerns, and I understand other concerns even outside of China about someone with that background. But I think there are lots of reasons for, like you were talking about, also understanding it's likely going to be an American leading the institution, and Mr. Malpass is one of the better choices. And it's often been raised in the press recently that if Mr. Malpass is rejected, the next nominee could be much worse. So it's probably likely he will pass for that reason, and the world will probably be better off by comparison, if only for that negative assumption.
John, what do you make of his analysis?
I mostly agree, other than the statement that Robert said that it's likely to be an American-led institution. No, it's going to be an American-led institution. There's no doubt about this. And I think we have to be realistic here because, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to be a nominee from the United States. And nobody in Washington right now is going to stand up in front of a subcommittee in a congressional hearing to praise Belt and Road Initiative. No politician is going to say anything like this, right? So they're all going to say something, you know, bad-mouthing. They're going to bad-mouth you know, the Belt and Road Initiative. So I wouldn't take it, you know, take with a grain of salt with this. And I think, you know, I totally agree with what Robert said. You know, if you're given a choice, he's not bad. I mean, his credentials and even the things he said about China, I think you have to take with a grain of salt. And if we consider the next one, it's going to be even worse.
Despite your very strong defense about this guy, we have the benefits of doubt, given his track record in criticizing this and that. Let's look at the future of the Bretton Woods system, which was established in the wake of the Second World War, and World Bank, IMF are, of course, the two major arms of this financial framework. Since the separation of the US dollar from gold standard in the early 1970s, critics in the West and East said unanimously, the US dollar has basically lost its leadership and financial strength as a result. Therefore, it is the American military and other things that may be indicative of its leadership that helps, say, maintain the US financial leadership one way or another.
Yeah.
What do you think of the competitiveness of the Bretton Woods? I mean, the world in the 21st century is so different from when the World Bank was first established.
Right. Well, I mean, look at the possible challenges here. You know, I think for the most part, the U.S. dollar is still a currency of exchange for many large part of the world trade, for large part of the credit market, and the only the viable competitor is the euro, and the euro is not doing so well for the last 2 decades or so. What are other alternatives? I think China's RMB is becoming an increasingly important player, but I think if you look at
the latest science show the devaluation of RMB.
But there's a separate issue here. I mean, the RMB devaluation, it fluctuates, and it always fluctuates. But if you look at how RMB is being used in international transactions, how it's actually being treated as a possible reserve. Of course, it's a luxury to
talk about the internationalization of RMB at this moment.
Yeah.
We're talking about the legitimacy of US dollars at this defining moment of the US relative decline. I mean, I hate to say the US strength is declining.
No.
It means, in Fareed Zakari's words, in the post-US era, it's the rise of the rest that matters more.
I totally agree with that. I don't mean to be apologist for the greenback. That's for sure. I mean, whether the legitimacy of the greenback can be subject to controversy, subject to debate. But I think the fact is, the reality is that it's still a very important currency. Every time there's a crisis, people rush to dollar. Rush to gold. So I think that testifies that the U.S. dollar is still a very effective international currency.
But in terms of the U.S. leadership, I disagree to some extent. Let's say, if you look at the recent couple of years since Donald Trump assumed the leadership over there, in terms of their dealing with the Iranian issue, giving up the agreement. Basically agreed upon by the major powers around the world. They are going alone. They are following the principle of America first or American only. Is that the leadership the world needs? And now the European countries, they are establishing an alternative system, an alternative to SWIFT system, paying system in terms of Iranian issues. U.S. is pressuring its allies in European countries to distance themselves from China. They are pushing the world to a dangerous, like disaster. The situation is very much like the pre-1914 First World War. The U.S. is demonstrating this huge, degree of irresponsibility as the #1 country in the world. I'm not sure where's the leadership.
So, Robert, what do you think of the issue of leadership credibility?
Well, undeniably, under the current U.S. president, America has been retreating from the multilateral order. I don't think anyone can dispute that. I think, though, the bigger question becomes, isn't the whole world kind of going this way? If we were to look at China's policies in some regards, yes, Belt and Road is somewhat multilateral, but it's essentially bilateral in the way it's structured. China practices internet sovereignty, which walls itself off from the rest of the World Wide Web. So it's not only the United States or Europe or others, you know, I mean, it's all around the world that we see an increased attention to serving self-interest over world interest. And I would say that's problematic because Bretton Woods, to your point, Young Ray, was originally designed for a truly integrated global order, and we're seeing fraying of that. And hopefully it won't get so bad as, you know, the parallel to 1914 would suggest.
So what do you think of the reform of the World Bank? Other than streamlining bureaucratic red tapes, that's for sure. But what do you think of the future of the World Bank to live up to expectations of emerging markets? And emerging markets, by the way, become a controversial concept. In a way, most of the emerging markets face problems of underdevelopment, such as liquidity, debts, so on and so forth. But let's look at the future of Bretton Woods. Do you think this is also a major task in terms of reforming the World Bank?
Well, one of the things, by the way, to the subject of David Malpass, he has advocated more market-driven solutions for emerging markets. So he's saying less lending from the World Bank, more private sector participation. So it's not as if it's to say, under his view for moving forward, that the emerging markets would be ignored. To your question, I would say yes, the World Bank and other multilateral institutions, by the way, China has the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, IMF, all of these groups, as well as the private sector, should focus on emerging markets and helping them become more developed markets and participating more equally in the global trading system.
A follow-up question, gentlemen, is the importance of AIIB. Three major arms of Bretton Woods, of course, include World Bank, IMF, and ADB, Asia Development Bank.
Right.
But what about the emerging financial institution of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank? As Robert said earlier, do you think AIIB is likely to fill in the vacancy left behind by a new World Bank under the new leadership of a new president? So does that mean a different roadmap for the international financial order?
Well, I think there's a room for all these international organizations. The fundamental business making loans. I mean, at the end of the day, the distinction between a private investment bank, a private commercial bank, and these international organizations is that these probably are lower cost loans, and it's more focused on loans that the private sector will issue. But China. The thing is that these banks, they're all controlled by particular countries. ADB is controlled by Japan, World Bank is controlled by the U.S., and they have their own preference, their own agenda.
Oh, by the way, China is not the principal shareholder of the AIIB. Right. It follows and respects rules set forth by the Western economies, right?
Well, that's true. That's true. They are following this highest standard in terms of giving loans to the projects, mostly developing countries. But also they are focusing on the infrastructure mostly. There's a gap in between the need and the real investment in this sector. So I agree with John. Probably there is a need more development banks in terms of helping the poor countries to develop.
Yeah. Right. And also my suggestion to AIIB is that you don't have to necessarily restrict only on Asia. There's a much larger world out there. Africa, Latin America, it's all arenas where the bank can play a very important role in terms of helping these countries.
That's why most of our questions today focus on why President Trump says money from the World Bank should be spent more effectively and more wisely. What does that mean for the developing countries? Because we have the developed North and the underdeveloped South, That remains an open question for our future discussions. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.